Think about the first thing a newborn baby does. It cries. It takes its first breath, and it screams. 2,500 years ago, in ancient Greece, that scream meant something different than it means today. It didn't mean you were alive. It meant you were being evaluated, because in the world that invented democracy, philosophy, and the Olympic Games, a baby wasn't automatically considered a person. A newborn wasn't even given a name for the first week of its life, and the reason for that is one of the darkest details in all of ancient history. If you are using this to fall asleep, perfect. These stories have been waiting millennia. They'll be here when you wake up, subscribe, and stick around. When a baby was born in ancient Athens, the household announced it to the neighborhood by decorating the front door. An olive wreath meant a boy had arrived. A strip of wool meant a girl. And in that simple distinction, the entire trajectory of a child's life was already being shaped. But before any of that could happen, the baby had to pass its first test. And this is where the story stops feeling like history and starts feeling like something else entirely. Within the first few days of birth, the father, the head of the household, would examine the child. He had absolute authority over what happened next. If the baby appeared healthy and the family could support another child, the father accepted it. He would lift the infant and carry it around the central hearth in a ceremony called the Amphidromia, introducing the child to the household gods. But if the baby was sickly, if it was deformed, if it was a girl, and the family already had too many daughters, if the family simply couldn't afford another mouth to feed, the father could reject it. And rejection in ancient Greece meant something very specific. The rejected infant would be exposed, left outside, usually at a crossroads or on a hillside, to whatever fate the gods decided. Some were found by strangers and raised as slaves. Some were taken in by families who wanted children. Most simply died. The comic poet Posidippus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, put it bluntly. Everyone raises a son, he wrote, even if he is poor. But a daughter is exposed even if the father is rich. Girls were a financial burden. They required dowries. They couldn't inherit property. They couldn't become citizens. In the cold arithmetic of ancient Greek society, daughters cost more than they were worth. Now, how common was this practice? Historians still argue about it. A 2019 study by archaeologist Debbie Sneed examined the evidence and concluded that the famous stories about Spartans throwing babies off cliffs were probably exaggerated. She found skeletons of infants with severe birth defects who had clearly been cared for, sometimes for months. Someone had loved those babies. Someone had fed them and held them despite their conditions. But exposure certainly happened. We know because Greek literature is full of abandoned children. Oedipus was exposed as an infant, so was the hero Perseus. These myths resonated with Greek audiences because the practice was familiar to them. They knew what it meant to leave a baby on a hillside. They had seen it, or heard of it, or feared it. And here is the detail that makes this practice even harder to understand. The Greeks didn't name their children until the 7th or 10th day of life. They waited, because so many newborns died in those first days from infection, from illness, from simple frailty, that giving a name too early felt like tempting fate. Modern estimates suggest that as many as 40% of children born in ancient Greece did not survive to marriageable age. 4 out of every 10. Think about that. In a world without antibiotics, without clean water standards, without understanding of germ theory, having a baby was an act of hope performed in the shadow of almost certain grief. Archaeologists have found small ceramic feeding bottles in children's graves across Greece. Little vessels with spouts small enough for an infant's mouth. Some of them still have tooth marks on the spout where a baby had gnawed on it. Archaeologist Debbie Sneed, who studied these bottles extensively, noted that some were found alongside the remains of infants with severe birth defects. Infants who had clearly been cared for over weeks and months, despite their conditions. Someone made that bottle for a specific child. Someone held it to a specific mouth. And when the child died, someone placed the bottle in the grave because it had mattered. It had been part of a life, however brief, but for the children who did survive those first terrifying days, for the babies whose fathers lifted them up and carried them around the hearth, life in ancient Greece could be surprisingly recognizable, because Greek children played, and the toys they played with look remarkably like the toys your own children play with today. Archaeologists have found rattles shaped like pigs and roosters in children's tombs, dating back to the 4th century BCE. They found spinning tops made of wood and clay, pull toys on wheels, little horses and dogs that a child could drag around on a string, yo-yos made from terracotta discs, dolls with jointed arms and legs that could be posed and dressed in miniature clothing, sewn by the women of the house. The Greek philosopher Archytas, who lived in the 4th century BCE, is credited with inventing a specific type of rattle for children. Aristotle himself approved of the invention, noting that children needed something to occupy their hands and mouths, or they'd destroy everything in the house. Some things apparently never change. The most popular game among Greek children was knucklebones. These were the ankle bones of sheep and goats, small enough to fit in a child's hand, and they were used in games that looked remarkably like modern jacks. You'd toss one bone in the air and try to scoop up as many others as you could before it landed. Children carried their knuckle bones around in little pouches, and some had them polished smooth from years of handling. Archaeologists have found knuckle bones made not just from bone but from bronze, glass, and even lead. They were, in the words of one classical scholar, all over the place. A painted Greek vase from around 440 BCE shows a boy playing with a terracotta yo-yo disc. The Greeks invented the yo-yo. They also played a game called Ostrakinder, where children painted one side of a shell black to represent night and left the other side natural for day. They'd flip the shell, and whichever side landed up, that team chased the other. It was tag, ancient Greek tag, played with seashells instead of a shout. They also played hide and seek. The Greeks called it cryptinder. One child covered their eyes and counted while the others scattered into courtyards and alleyways and behind storage jars. Tug of war, which they called Helkistinda, was played with a leather rope, and a game called Ephedrismos was essentially piggyback with stakes. One player would set up a stone target, and if you missed your throw, you had to carry the other player on your back with your eyes covered while they steered you toward the target by pulling your ears. Ball games were everywhere. Children made balls from inflated pig bladders or tied bundles of rags into a round shape. They played a game similar to basketball where you had to bounce a ball and keep it alive. They played catch. They played catch. They played keep away. The Greeks even had a version of field hockey played with curved sticks and a ball on sandy ground. All of these games were painted onto pottery, frozen in time, on the surfaces of vases and cups that survived while the children who played the games did not. Greek children also had pets. Dogs were the most common. Archaeologists have found terracotta figurines of children holding small dogs, embracing them, playing with them. Some families kept goats, tortoises, and pet birds in cages. There is even evidence of children keeping mice as pets, feeding them scraps and carrying them around in their clothing. The bond between a child and an animal is apparently as old as civilization itself, but all of this play, all of these games and toys and pets, came with an expiration date, because Greek childhood was not designed to last. It was a brief window, and when it closed hard. But here is where the story of Greek childhood splits in two, because at around age 7, everything changed, and what happened to you depended on two things: your gender and which city you lived in. If you were a boy in Athens, your 7th birthday was essentially the first day of school. Your father or a household slave called a pedagogos would walk you to a small room where a teacher waited with wax tablets and a stylus. You would learn to read and write. You would memorize Homer. Every educated Athenian man could recite passages from the Iliad and the Odyssey from memory, and that memorization started at age 7. The pedagogos is one of the most interesting figures in Athenian childhood. He was usually an older slave, sometimes a prisoner of war, sometimes a man too old for heavy labor. His job was to accompany the boy everywhere, to school, to the gymnasium. Through the streets he was bodyguard, chaperone, and disciplinarian all in one. And he carried a stick, because part of his job was to beat the boy if he misbehaved. Schools were small, informal, and private. There was no public education system. If you could afford a teacher, your son learned. If you couldn't, he didn't. Class sizes were tiny, sometimes just 5 or 6 boys sitting on wooden benches, while a teacher dictated or demonstrated. Books were almost non-existent, handwritten on papyrus and fantastically expensive. A single scroll could cost more than a month's wages for a laborer. So education was oral. You listened, you repeated, you memorized. You recited back what you'd been told until it was carved into your memory as deeply as the letters on a wax tablet. Discipline was physical and immediate. Teachers beat boys for poor performance. The pedagogos beat boys for poor behavior. Fathers beat boys for bringing home bad reports. A Greek boy's education was shaped, quite literally, by the threat of violence. And yet, The Athenians considered themselves more civilized than the Spartans. That should tell you something about the scale we're working with here. Alongside reading and writing, you'd learn music. The lyre was the standard instrument, and playing it well was considered essential to being a civilized person. A man who couldn't play the lyre was considered uneducated. Regardless of what else he knew, you'd learn mathematics, enough for business and civic duties. And as you grew older, you'd learn rhetoric, the art of speaking persuasively in public. In a direct democracy where citizens voted on policy in person, the ability to make a compelling argument wasn't a luxury, it was survival, and alongside the intellectual training came physical training. Every afternoon, boys went to the gymnasium or the palastra, the wrestling school. They ran, they wrestled, they threw the javelin and the discus. They exercised naked, which is where the word gymnasium comes from, the Greek word gymnos, meaning naked. The goal was balance. The Athenians wanted men who could think and fight in equal measure. A man who was brilliant but physically weak was considered incomplete. A man who was strong but ignorant was considered dangerous. The ideal was the well-rounded citizen, as comfortable debating philosophy as he was throwing a spear. But here is the thing. This education was only available to boys, and only to boys from families who could afford it. If you were poor, you went to work. You learned your father's trade. You became a potter or a farmer or a fisherman by doing it, not by studying it. And if you were a girl in Athens, regardless of your family's wealth, your education happened entirely at home. You learned from your mother, you learned to weave, to spin wool, to cook, to manage a household. You learned to sing and dance, because these were considered appropriate female accomplishments. But you did not learn to read. You did not learn to write. In the most intellectually advanced civilization the ancient world had ever produced, half the population was kept deliberately illiterate. Athenian girls rarely left the house. They lived in the gynaikeon, the women's quarters, usually the upper floor. They could venture out for certain religious festivals and funerals, but daily life was confined to the domestic sphere. Their world was the courtyard, the loom, and the kitchen. Their education was preparation for one thing and one thing only: marriage. And marriage came early. Athenian girls were typically married between the ages of 14 and 15. Their husbands were often twice their age, men in their late 20s or 30s who had completed their military training and were established enough to support a household. The girl had no say in the arrangement. Her father chose her husband, and on the eve of her wedding, the girl performed a ritual that marked the end of her childhood in a way that is almost unbearably poignant. She gathered up her toys, her dolls, her knucklebones, her spinning tops, everything she had played with since she was small, and she carried them to the temple of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and protector of young girls. And she left them there. She also cut a lock of her hair and dedicated it to the goddess. The message was clear: childhood was over. The girl who played with dolls no longer existed. In her place was a woman whose body now belonged to her husband's household. She was 14 years old. If you are still awake, consider this. The same civilization that produced Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, the civilization that laid the foundations for Western thought, was also a civilization that married its daughters off at 14 to men they'd never chosen, after a childhood spent learning nothing but domestic skills. The contradiction is staggering, and it tells you something important about how selectively the Greeks defined the word freedom. Now, everything I've just described was Athens, the cultural capital of ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy. If you were a child in Sparta, roughly 150 miles to the southwest, your experience would have been completely, terrifyingly different, because Sparta didn't want thinkers. Sparta wanted soldiers. In Sparta, the state's interest in your child began at birth. According to the historian Plutarch, writing centuries later, newborn babies were brought to a group of tribal elders at a place called the Lesha for examination. If the baby was judged healthy and strong, the father was allowed to raise it. If the baby was judged weak, deformed, or otherwise unfit for the demands of Spartan life, the elders ordered it taken to a place near Mount Taygetus and abandoned. Now, modern historians have questioned how literally we should take Plutarch's account. He was writing 700 years after the events he described. Archaeological excavations at the supposed site on Taygetus have found adult skeletons, but no infant remains. It is possible the practice was exaggerated, or that it happened less frequently than the sources suggest. But the fact that the story was told at all, and told without horror, reveals something profound about how Sparta valued its children. You were valuable insofar as you could serve the state. If you couldn't, you were disposable. For the Spartan children who passed that first inspection, the next 7 years were spent at home. Spartan parents, unlike Athenian ones, didn't coddle their children. Elders would wash newborn boys in wine, believing it would harden them. Spartan children were deliberately not swaddled tightly, on the theory that unrestricted movement would make them stronger. They were taught not to fear the dark, not to cry, not to be fussy about food. And then, at age 7, everything changed. Because that was the day the state came to take your son. The agoge, the word means raising, in the way you raise livestock toward a specific purpose. Spartan boys entered this state-run training program at 7 years old. They wouldn't leave until they were 30. They wouldn't be considered full citizens until they completed it. And most of what happened inside would be considered child abuse by any modern standard. The boys were organized into groups called herds, overseen by older boys who had authority to discipline them. They were given minimal clothing. From age 12 onward, each boy received exactly 1 cloak per year, no shoes, no tunic, 1 rough cloak, summer and winter. They slept on mats, they wove themselves from reeds, they pulled from the river with their bare hands, and they were deliberately underfed. This wasn't neglect, it was policy. The Spartans believed that hunger taught resourcefulness. If the boys wanted to eat, they were expected to steal from gardens, steal from kitchens, steal from wherever they could find food. But if they were caught stealing, they weren't punished for the theft. They were beaten for being clumsy enough to get caught. Plutarch tells the story of a Spartan boy who stole a live fox and hid it under his cloak. When an adult stopped to question him, the boy stood perfectly still while the fox clawed and bit into his stomach. He said nothing. He didn't flinch. He died rather than reveal the theft. And the Spartans told this story not as a tragedy, but as an example of ideal behavior. That was the kind of child they were trying to produce. The communal meal, the syssitia, was central to Spartan life and began during the agage. Boys ate together in groups. The signature dish was a black broth made from pork blood, vinegar, and salt. It was reportedly so unappetizing that a visitor from the Greek colony of Sybaris, famous for its luxury, tasted it and said he finally understood why the Spartans were so willing to die in battle. Nobody who ate that broth, he claimed, could possibly be afraid of death, but the shared meals served a deeper purpose. The Spartans understood something about bonds formed through shared suffering. Boys who starved together, who slept in the cold together, who were beaten together, formed loyalties that lasted a lifetime. The man standing next to you in the phalanx wasn't just a fellow soldier. He was the boy who had shared your hunger. That bond was stronger than anything a comfortable childhood could produce. At least, that was the theory. The punishment was severe. Flogging was routine. Boys were beaten for weakness, for crying, for complaining, for any display of emotion that didn't serve the collective. At the festival of Artemis Orthia, adolescent boys underwent a ritual flogging at the temple altar while spectators watched. The goal was to endure without crying out. Some boys died during this ritual. In later centuries, under Roman rule, it became a tourist attraction. Romans came to watch Spartan teenagers being whipped. Think about that for a second. A civilization that trained 7-year-old boys by starving them, beating them, and making them sleep barefoot on reed mats in winter. And this wasn't considered cruel. This was considered the finest education system in Greece. Plato admired it. Aristotle praised it. Xenophon wrote about it with something that sounds very much like envy, but the Spartans weren't only about brutality. The boys learned to read and write, though just barely. Enough for military messages, not for philosophy. They learned music. They learned to dance, because coordinated movement was essential for the phalanx. The tight military formation that made Spartan soldiers virtually unbreakable on the battlefield, and they learned to speak with devastating brevity. The word laconic comes from Laconia, the region around Sparta. Spartan boys were trained to deliver cutting insults and razor-sharp responses in as few words as possible. A wordy Spartan was a failed Spartan. Economy of speech was a martial virtue. When Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, sent a threatening message to Sparta warning that if he invaded their land he would destroy their city, burn their crops, and enslave their people, the Spartans sent back a one-word reply. If that word tells you everything about what the agage was designed to produce. Not scholars, not poets. Men who could compress absolute defiance into a single syllable. At age 20, If a young man had survived the agoge, he became eligible for one of the communal dining messes. Every current member had to approve him. A single blackball meant rejection, and rejection meant he could never become a full Spartan citizen. He would live as a social outcast in a society that valued belonging above everything. Even after acceptance, a Spartan man continued to live in the barracks until age 30. He could marry before that, but he couldn't live with his wife. He slept with his brothers in arms. His loyalty belonged to the state first, to his messmates second, and to his family third. Always third. At around age 18, the most promising graduates of the Agage were selected for the Krypteia, and this is where the story becomes something genuinely disturbing. The Krypteia was a secretive unit. Young men were sent out into the countryside at night, armed with nothing but a dagger. Their mission was to hunt and kill helots, the enslaved population that did all of Sparta's agricultural labor. According to Plutarch, every autumn the Spartan leaders formally declared war on the helots, so that any killing could occur without religious guilt. These teenagers were being taught to kill, not in theory, not in simulation. They were killing real people in the dark as a graduation exercise, and this was the system that produced the 300 who fought at Thermopylae. The warriors we celebrate in films and books and mythology, they were, in a very real sense, children who had been broken down and rebuilt as weapons. The cost of Spartan military greatness was Spartan childhood, but here is the thing that surprises most people. Spartan girls had it better than Athenian girls. Not good. Better, which tells you something about how bad things were in Athens. In Sparta, girls were required to exercise. They ran, they wrestled, they threw the javelin. They competed in public athletic contests alongside boys, which would have scandalized Athens. The reasoning wasn't feminist, it was eugenic. The Spartans believed that strong mothers produced strong babies. A physically fit woman would deliver healthier soldiers. But the practical result was that Spartan women were the most physically independent women in the entire Greek world. Spartan girls also received education. They learned poetry, history, music, and reading. They could own property. They could speak their minds in public. When a woman from Attica once asked Queen Gorgo why Spartan women were the only women in Greece who could rule their men, Gorgo reportedly answered, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." Spartan women also married later than Athenian women, typically around 18 rather than 14. And Spartan marriage customs were, to put it mildly, unusual. The bride had her hair cut short and was dressed in men's clothing. The groom would sneak into the dark room where she waited, carry her to bed, and then leave to sleep in the military barracks. This secret visiting arrangement sometimes continued for years. Plutarch notes that some Spartan couples had children before ever seeing each other in daylight, and the Spartan mothers. The mothers were something else entirely. A Spartan mother who lost her son in battle was expected to feel pride, not grief. The famous injunction given to soldiers was return with your shield or on it. Your shield was too heavy to carry while running. So if you came back with it, you had stood your ground. If you came back on it, you had died fighting. The only acceptable outcomes: surrender, retreat, survival without honor. These were worse than death. And it was the mothers who enforced this code. Plutarch records that when a Spartan boy complained to his mother that his sword was too short, she told him to step closer to the enemy. When another mother learned her son had fled from battle, she reportedly said she wished he had never been born. These stories may be exaggerated or invented, but the fact that they were told, and told with approval, reveals a culture that valued the state's survival over any single child's life. Spartan childhood was not preparation for a happy adulthood. It was preparation for a useful death. Now, let's go back to Athens, because the rituals that marked a Greek child's passage through life are some of the most fascinating details in all of ancient history, and many of them will feel strangely familiar. Remember, the baby wasn't named until the 7th or 10th day. The ceremony of acceptance, the amphidromia, happened around the 5th day. The father ran around the central hearth carrying the infant. Relatives brought gifts. They tied amulets around the baby's body to ward off evil spirits and demons. Because the Greeks had no medical explanation for why so many newborns died, they attributed infant death to supernatural forces. The naming ceremony on the 10th day, called the Decate, was a public celebration. The firstborn son was traditionally named after his paternal grandfather, a custom that still survives in Greece today. 2,500 years later, the name linked the child to the family line, to the ancestral gods, to the community. It made the child real. Everything before the Decate was provisional. After it, the child existed. Between the ages of 3 and 4, Athenian boys participated in a ceremony called the Choose, held during the spring festival of the Anthesteria. Each child was presented with a small pitcher and had his first taste of wine. The ceremony may have marked the end of infancy and the beginning of childhood proper. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these tiny Choose pitchers, many of them decorated with paintings of toddlers playing. Think about that. The Greeks marked the end of babyhood by giving a 3-year-old wine. The ceremony was specific to Attica, the region around Athens, and it was one of the first steps in a child's long journey from infant to citizen. The fact that it involved wine tells you everything about how central wine was to Greek life. It was communion. It was community. It was belonging. For boys, the next major milestone came at age 16, during the festival of the Apatoria. The boy was introduced to his phratry, his hereditary group, and his hair was ceremonially cut. The hair was dedicated to the gods, a physical sacrifice marking the end of boyhood. Until this moment, Athenian boys wore their hair long. The cutting was public, witnessed by relatives and community members, an announcement that this child was becoming something else. At 18, he was registered in his deme, his local political unit, and gained legal majority. Then came 2 years of compulsory military training as an ephebe. The ephebes swore an oath that has survived to this day. They pledged to never disgrace their sacred weapons, to never desert their comrades in battle, to leave their fatherland not diminished but greater and better than they found it. It was, in essence, a promise to be worthy of the citizenship they were about to receive. During those 2 years, the Ephebes patrolled the borders of Attica, learned to fight in formation, trained with weapons, and practiced the military skills that every citizen was expected to possess. Athens was a democracy, but it was also a society perpetually at war with its neighbors. Every voter was also a potential soldier. At 20, the young man re-entered civilian life as a full adult citizen with the right to vote, own property, and participate in the assembly. 20 years from helpless infant to citizen of Athens. It was a journey measured in rituals, each one marking a new stage, each one binding the child more tightly to the community. Birth, naming, first wine, hair cutting, military training, citizenship. Every step was public, witnessed, recorded. You didn't just grow up in Athens. You were seen growing up. For girls, the path was shorter and led in only one direction. At around age 5 to 10, some Athenian girls from good families were sent to serve at the sanctuary of Artemis at Broron. There they became Arctoi, little she-bears, and participated in a mysterious ritual called the Octia. They wore saffron, colored tunics, and danced for the goddess. The ritual seems to have been a coming-of-age ceremony, transforming wild girls into civilized young women ready for marriage. The myth behind the ritual is telling. According to legend, a bear sacred to Artemis had been killed after it scratched a young girl. As punishment, Artemis sent a plague upon Athens. The only way to appease her was to send young girls to serve at her sanctuary, playing the bear running wild in the woods. Before being tamed into the role of wife and mother, the ritual acknowledged something that Greek society otherwise denied: that girls before marriage were wild creatures, free, untamed, and that the process of turning them into wives required something like a sacrifice. Excavations at Broron have uncovered hundreds of small pottery vessels depicting girls running, racing, even undressing, images that are almost unique in Greek art, where women and girls were otherwise shown as modest and still. For a brief moment, in a sacred space, under the protection of a goddess, Greek girls were allowed to be children, and then it was over, and then came the dedication of toys. The dolls placed in Artemis's temple, the lock of hair cut and offered, the childhood put away forever marriage, motherhood, the gynaikeon, the loom. That was the entire arc of an Athenian girl's life, beginning to end, with no deviation permitted. And here is where archaeology gives us something that the literary sources don't: a glimpse of love, because those toys that were dedicated at temples and placed in children's graves weren't mass-produced trinkets. Many of them were handmade, carefully crafted. A mother carving a miniature horse, a father shaping a rattle from clay, the pull toy with wheels that a child dragged across the courtyard, day after day, until the string wore thin. A terracotta horse on wheels found in the Kerameikos Cemetery in Athens dates to roughly 950 BCE, 3,000 years old. A child loved that horse, dragged it through dust that has long since blown away, across courtyards that crumbled centuries ago. In a city that has been destroyed and rebuilt a dozen times, the horse survived. The child didn't. But someone who loved that child placed the horse in the grave so it wouldn't have to face the underworld alone. That is the thing about studying childhood in the ancient world. The sources are written by men, about men, for men. Children barely appear in the historical record. Girls appear even less. But the objects survive. The rattles and the dolls and the feeding bottles with tooth marks on the spout. And they tell us something that the philosophers and historians never bothered to write down. They tell us that Greek parents loved their children, fiercely, desperately, in a world that took children away constantly and without warning. They loved them enough to carve toys for them and sew doll clothes and tie amulets around their wrists to ward off evil. They loved them even when they knew that loving them was dangerous, because grief was always waiting. The philosopher Plutarch, the same man who wrote so clinically about Spartan infanticide, also wrote a letter to his wife after the death of their 2-year-old daughter Timoxena. In it, he remembers how the little girl used to ask her nurse to offer her breast to her dolls and toys, sharing her food with the things she loved. It is one of the most tender passages in all of ancient literature, written by a man who was supposed to be above such emotion, and that contrast is the real story of childhood in ancient Greece. It was brutal and tender at the same time. A civilization that could expose unwanted infants on hillsides could also carve little horses for the children it kept. A culture that trained 7-year-olds to steal food and endure beatings could also produce yo-yos and rattles and jointed dolls with movable arms. If you are drifting off right now, that is perfectly fine. Let me leave you with this. The distance between ancient Greece and your bedroom tonight is measured in millennia, but some things haven't changed at all. Children still play with dolls and spinning tops and pull toys. Parents still stay up at night terrified that something will happen to their baby. Fathers still lift their children into their arms and carry them through the house. Mothers still sit with their daughters and teach them the skills they'll need for the world ahead. The ancient Greeks lived in a world without mercy for the weak, without options for women, without medicine for the sick. And yet they carved little horses with wheels for their children to drag through the dust. They shaped rattles from clay so their babies would have something to hold. They tied amulets around tiny wrists and whispered prayers to gods they hoped were listening. They did what every parent has always done. They held on as tightly as they could for as long as they were allowed. And when the world took their children anyway, through disease, through war, through the simple cruelty of a time without antibiotics, they placed a small clay horse in the grave and hoped it was enough. It wasn't enough. It never is. But they did it anyway. That is what parents do. That is what parents have always done. Good night.